Diaspora wars this, diaspora wars that. White supremacy don't care, it just sees black. I was born in Nassau, Bahamas. One of the first things I learned to hold with pride as a Bahamian child was our flag, because the gold represents the sun, the aquamarine represents the water, and most important of all, the black represents the people. I bet money that most people who've heard of or even visited the Bahamas know nothing of Bahamians as a people. Likely call us Bohemians instead of Bahamians, just like they call Bajans Barbadians. They likely think the Bahamas is just one island named Bahamas, instead of a collection of 700 islands and keys that comprise the Commonwealth of the Bahamas. They don't know lowercasing the T in the Bahamas is basically blasphemous to a Bahamian, because the only thing they know about this little black island nation we take so much pride in is that it would make a good tourist destination. Before that, it made a good place for an American embassy. Before that, a good colony for Britain. Before that, a good place for Spain to enslave the Arawaks who first called it home. What the world knows about the Bahamas is how we can benefit them. And that pattern doesn't start or end with us. There isn't a black people anywhere on earth who have not felt the weight of colonization, empire, and white supremacy. And there isn't a black people anywhere on earth who didn't resist it. From Haiti to the Congo, from Burkina Faso to Grenada, from Mississippi to Guyana. We are not a people waiting on revolution. We are a people whose revolutions were crushed, whose revolutionaries were killed, whose governments were destabilized, whose victories were rewritten. And then we were taught to forget. Black people all across the world and time have tried and executed every approach to achieving our freedom. From violent overthrow to nonviolence to strategic alliances to intracommunal building, no stone has been left unturned. And imperialism has always responded with aggression. But it's not enough for us to each resist in our own pockets of the world. The war on Black power is global. We cannot defeat it alone. We need solidarity throughout the entire Black diaspora because we are fighting the same war. We want the same things, and our fight is indivisible from one another's. But we don't know that because empire makes sure that all we know about each other's nations is how it benefits them, not the history, the resistance, the revolutions, and the Black pride that connects us all. So today, we're going to remember some of the revolutions and revolutionaries they made us forget. Starting with Haiti, because Haiti is where Black revolution begins. But before we do that, let me tell you about this video's sponsor, Hungry Root. If you didn't know, your girl hates to cook, and I also despise grocery shopping. Listen, it's leftover trauma from growing up with an army of siblings who would pile in and out of my mommy's Nissan Quest to go to the food store every single day. So Hungry Root is perfect for me because they do most of the legwork for me. No, seriously, it's basically a personal nutrition coach and shopper in one because it plans and recommends meals that I can order tailored to my taste, nutrition preferences, and health goals, which has revolutionized my life as a gal with an autoimmune disorder who can now easily avoid the gluten and inflammatory things I'm not supposed to be eating, and now that Hungry Root can do it for me. And unlike other food delivery services, Hungry Root has over 50,000 recipes to choose from every week. And they also have these amazing microwavable meals if you truly want to do the bare minimum like I do. There's something for every taste and nutrition preference. So take advantage of this exclusive offer. For a limited time, get 40% off your first box. Plus, get a free item in every box for life. Click the link below or go to hungryroot.com and use code Illuminati. That's 40% off first box and a free item of your choice for life at hungryroot.com with the code Illuminati. Thank you for sponsoring this video, Hungry Root. We are free, and we have conquered our liberty by the effusion of our blood. We have known how to face dangers to obtain our liberty. We shall know how to brave death to maintain it. Today, Haitian people are some of the most disrespected people in the world. That is not coincidence. It is consequence. Haiti was the first and only successful slave revolution in history. Slavery is an atrocity that was brutal everywhere. In Haiti, which was then called Saint-Domingue, enslaved Africans died so regularly that they would constantly import people to replace them. Historically, when enslaved people revolted or attempted to escape in America, they'd sometimes be sent to plantations in Haiti and other islands in the Caribbean as punishment. About 90% of Haiti's population were enslaved Africans, who were brutalized and worked so tirelessly that for France, Haiti was the wealthiest colony in their empire, while the enslaved Africans saw none of that wealth. But in August 1791, the enslaved Africans of Saint-Domingue didn't just revolt, they led the largest coordinated revolt of enslaved people in history. Haiti is proof that Black people, enslaved Africans, never waited for their freedom. They never passively accepted the conditions of slavery, contrary to what people like Kanye West seem to think.
For 400 years, that sounds like a choice. Like, you was there for 400 years and it's all of y'all?
Led in part by Toussaint Louverture, a military leader who'd been inspired by the French Revolution, Haitians went to war with their colonizers. They burned plantations to the ground, they captured and killed slave masters, they fought and defeated France, Spain, and Britain. By 1801, Toussaint had written the Haitian Constitution, declared racial equality, and abolished slavery. And importantly enough, he had attempted to maintain some semblance of allegiance to France. He didn't want to destroy France or Western empires for destroying them sake. He wanted Haiti to be free, to be allowed self-governance and self-determination. Despite his simple desire for peace and Haitian independence, a free Haiti was just so great a threat to not just France, but all the imperialist nations who'd colonized Black countries and enslaved Africans all around the globe, that Napoleon sent 20,000 troops to Haiti for the express purpose of seizing Haiti, reestablishing slavery and control, and capturing Toussaint.
I am Toussaint Louverture. My name is perhaps known to you.
He was called the Black George Washington. He fought off 3 empires and enraged Napoleon.
The prospect of a Black Republic is equally disturbing to the Spanish, the English, and the Americans.
He championed liberty and égalité for all, Toussaint Louverture and the Haitian Revolution.
They did capture and imprison Toussaint, and he died in prison in 1803 the following year. But before his death, he said this: "In overthrowing me, you have cut down only the trunk of the tree of liberty. It will spring up again by the roots, for they are numerous and deep." And he was right, because although they captured Toussaint, they could not capture Haiti. Generals like Jean-Jacques Dessalines continued to fight, and by 1804, they declared themselves free, making Haiti the first Black republic in history. Yet, when people think about Haiti, they don't think of it as one of the wealthiest former colonies on Earth, or the blueprint that made Black independence possible. And that's because of what France did next. Just as Napoleon had deceived and retaliated against Toussaint, so too did France retaliate against Haitians. But the French weren't alone. They were joined by the US and other European powers, because a threat to one empire is a threat to them all. If Haiti was allowed to defeat the French Empire and thrive, what would it mean for enslaved Africans all over the globe? Wouldn't they too do what Haiti did? So Haiti had to be punished to discourage everyone else. Not only did they refuse to acknowledge Haiti as an independent nation, France, the US, and Europe as a whole got together and placed sanctions on Haiti for freeing themselves from slavery and colonization, requiring them to pay fines to France for the loss of slaves and property, which financially crippled Haiti, from which they've never recovered. Which is why today, Haiti is rarely remembered as the birthplace of the most radical democratic revolution of its time. It is remembered as poor, as chaotic, as dysfunctional. Its poverty is presented as proof of revolutionary failure and of the inability for Black nations to successfully govern ourselves. It's rarely presented as the consequence of revolutionary punishment. They used Haiti to send a message. This is what happens when you fight back, when you achieve independence. We'll cut you off at the kneecaps. But it wasn't enough to simply prevent Haiti from ever being able to thrive as an independent nation. They couldn't allow true independence at all, which is why the US began occupying Haiti in 1915, and they have continued destabilizing their country, planning coups, and interfering in their governance to this day. This is why Haiti is so important. Haiti is the blueprint for both successful revolution and every punishment for revolution. People often wait for and romanticize revolution, believing that revolution is the climax, that for all that's lost to achieve it, what's on the other side of revolution is independence, freedom, and self-determination. But what we first learned through Haiti, but continued and continue to learn, is that revolution is not the climax, it's the intermission. Or as Huey Newton put it in his book To Die for the People, revolution is a process and not a conclusion. That contradictions continue to generate struggle even after revolutionaries have seized power. This is so because new forms of oppression keep arising. What follows revolution is usually removal of our leaders and destabilization of the governments and movements they built. The punishment for revolution follows a simple playbook: diplomatic isolation, refusal of recognition, economic strangulation, military threat, and indemnity debt. Haitian scholar Michael Rolfe-Trouillot argued that the Haitian Revolution was unthinkable even as it happened because it contradicted the idea that Africans were inferior, that enslaved people didn't have the ability to revolt, to organize, or to defeat them. There was no intellectual framework at the time for enslaved Africans defeating European empires and governing themselves. The Haitian Revolution didn't just contradict this Enlightenment worldview. It contradicted their immoral and dishonest justification for subjugating and enslaving African people, which threatened to upend their empire. So while the revolution was undeniable on the battlefield, it was inconvenient for the history books. In Silencing the Past, Trouillot reminds us that history is not neutral, it is produced. And power determines which events are centered, which are minimized, and which are framed as anomalies rather than foundations. Haiti became the anomaly, but it was the blueprint. And what happened in Haiti would not stay in Haiti. It would echo across centuries, across oceans, until in 1960, in the newly independent nation of the Congo, Patrice Lumumba, the first prime minister of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, stood before his former colonizers, the King of Belgium, and gave a speech that shook the world but sealed his fate. In 1885, the Congo, which is the fourth largest country in Africa, with a population of more than 112 million people, was violently colonized by Belgium, led by their King Leopold. Belgium hadn't just claimed a free nation and its people established their rule, forced them into labor, and deprived them of their customs and traditions. Belgium brutalized and killed millions of Congolese people. Freedom was never in their cards for the Congolese, which is why, just like America did to its enslaved Africans, Belgium went to great lengths to deny Congolese people an education. That way, they figured, they would never have the capacity to free or govern themselves. This is consistent with the same Enlightenment period thinking that Michael Rolfe-Trouillot argued made the Haitian Revolution unthinkable even as it happened, to Europeans who couldn't conceive of Africans being intelligent enough to outmaneuver them or govern themselves. So Congolese people were denied access to schools, government, and any position of power, all of which was ruled for the white Europeans who ruled over them. Which is why the Patrice Lumumbas of the world were quite literally colonial power's worst nightmare. While Belgium stood between Congolese people and higher education and power, they still expected the Congolese people to fill the jobs they needed but didn't respect. And it was as a postal clerk and a bear company salesman that Patrice Lumumba gained access to books and newspapers, literacy, mobility, and the desire to educate himself. It was through his own self-taught and formal education that Patrice Lumumba embraced anti-colonialism and Pan-African thought. To Belgium, Lumumba was one of the good ones, someone who belonged to a small class of Congolese people that they referred to as évolués, which literally translated to evolved ones. But Patrice Lumumba, like all the Congolese, like all the Africans who'd been enslaved and transported everywhere else in the world, was greater than their racist understandings of him. By the 1950s, anti-colonialist uprisings and movements were taking shape all throughout Africa. African people and their revolutionary leaders were embracing the Pan-African belief that their struggles were connected, and so too would their victories be. Patrice Lumumba emerged as the leader of the Mouvement National Congolese Party and became one of the most prominent figures fighting for a free Africa and an independent Congo. After the January 1959 uprising in Leopoldville, named after King Leopold, who saw the Congo as his own personal property, Belgium feared that the Congolese people might launch a full-scale revolt, so they acquiesced to their independence. Although, as we learned with Haiti and Napoleon, they were being duplicitous. They never intended the Congo be free. Nevertheless, in May of 1960, the Congolese people held their first free election. By June 30th, 1960, the Congolese people declared their independence, renamed themselves the Democratic Republic of the Congo, elected Joseph Kasavubu their president, and Patrice Lumumba their prime minister. But it was at that Independence Day ceremony for the Democratic Republic of the Congo that Belgium's king not only sat in attendance, but had the audacity to praise Belgium's colonial rule, which prompted 34-year-old Patrice Lumumba to stand before him and deliver this speech, condemning colonialism and naming how Belgium had abused the Congolese people, how they fought for their freedom, and how they would fight to maintain it. Patrice Lumumba delivered this speech. Men and women of the Congo, victorious independence fighters, I salute you in the name of the Congolese government. I ask all of you, my friends, who tirelessly fought in our ranks, to mark this June 30th, 1960 as an illustrious date that will be ever engraved in your hearts. A date whose meaning you will proudly explain to your children, so that they in turn might relay to their grandchildren and great-grandchildren the glorious history of our struggle for freedom. Although this independence of the Congo is being proclaimed today by agreement with Belgium, an amicable country with which we are on equal terms, no Congolese will ever forget that independence was won in struggle, a persevering and inspired struggle carried on from day to day, a struggle in which we are undaunted by privation or suffering and stinted neither strength nor blood. It was filled with tears, fire, and blood. We are deeply proud of our struggle because it was just and noble and indispensable in putting an end to the humiliating bondage forced upon us. That was our lot for 80 years of colonial rule, and our wounds are too fresh and much too painful to be forgotten. We have experienced forced labor in exchange for pay that did not allow us to satisfy our hunger, to clothe ourselves, to have decent lodgings, or to bring up our children as dearly loved ones. Morning, noon, and night, we were subjected to jeers, insults, and blows because we were Negroes. Who will ever forget that the Black was addressed as two, not because he was a friend, but because the polite vous was reserved for the white man? We have seen our land seized in the name of ostensibly just laws, which gave recognition only to the right of might. We have not forgotten that the law was never the same for the white and the Black, that it was lenient to the ones and cruel and inhuman to the others. We have experienced the atrocious sufferings, being persecuted for political convictions and religious belief, and exiled from our native land. Our lot was worse than death itself. We have not forgotten that in the cities, the mansions were for the whites and the tumble-down huts for the Black, that a Black was not admitted to the cinemas, restaurants, and shops set aside for Europeans, that a Black traveled in the hold under the feet of the whites in their luxury cabins. Who will ever forget the shootings which killed so many of our brothers, of the cells into which were mercilessly thrown those who no longer wished to submit to the regime of injustice, oppression, and exploitation used by the colonialists as a tool of their domination? All that, my brothers, brought us untold suffering. But we who were elected by the votes of your representatives, representatives of the people, to guide our native land, we who have suffered in body and soul from the colonial oppression, we tell you that henceforth, all that is finished with. The Republic of the Congo has been proclaimed, and our beloved country's future is now in the hands of its own people. Brothers, let us commence together a new struggle, a sublime struggle that will lead our country to peace, prosperity, and greatness. Together we shall establish social justice and ensure for every man a fair remuneration for his labor. We shall show the world what the Black man can do when working in liberty, and we shall make the Congo the pride of Africa. We shall see to it that the lands of our native country truly benefit its children. We shall revise all the old laws and make them into new ones that will be just and noble. We shall stop the persecution of free thought. We shall see to it that all citizens enjoy to the fullest extent the basic freedoms provided for by the Declaration of Human Rights. We shall eradicate all discrimination, whatever its origin, and we shall ensure for everyone a station in life befitting his human dignity and worthy of his labor and his loyalty to the country. We shall institute in the country a peace resting not on guns and bayonets, but on concord and goodwill. And in all this, my dear compatriots, we can rely not only on our own enormous forces and immense wealth, but also on the assistance of the numerous foreign states whose cooperation we shall accept when it is not aimed at imposing upon us an alien policy, but is given in a spirit of friendship. Even Belgium, which has finally learned the lesson of history and need no longer try to oppose our independence, is prepared to give us its aid and friendship. For that end, an agreement has just been signed between our two equal and independent countries. I am sure that this cooperation will benefit both countries. For our part, we shall, while remaining vigilant, try to observe the engagements we have freely made. Thus, both in the internal and the external spheres, The new Congo being created by my government will be rich, free, and prosperous. But to attain our goal without delay, I ask all of you, legislators and citizens of the Congo, to give us all the help you can. I ask you all to sink your tribal quarrels. They weaken us and may cause us to be despised abroad. I ask you all not to shrink from any sacrifice for the sake of ensuring the success of our grand undertaking. Finally, I ask you unconditionally to respect the life and property of fellow citizens and foreigners who have settled in our country. If the conduct of these foreigners leaves much to be desired, our justice will promptly expel them from the territory of the Republic. If, on the contrary, their conduct is good, they must be left in peace, for they too are working for our country's prosperity. The Congo's independence is a decisive step towards the liberation of the whole African continent. Our government, a government of national and popular unity, will serve its country. I call on all Congolese citizens, men, women, and children, to set themselves resolutely to the task of creating a national economy and ensuring our economic independence. Eternal glory to the fighters for national liberation. Long live independence and African unity. Long live the independent and sovereign Congo. It was then that Belgium and other colonial empires knew that they had underestimated Patrice Lumumba. He wasn't one of the good ones, and he wouldn't passively accept only the appearance of independence. So they, along with the US and Britain, coordinated to assassinate him and destabilize the Congo so that they could continue draining the Congo of their resources at the detriment of the Congolese people. And that is precisely what they did. Quite literally, within days of the Congo declaring their independence, the country descended into a chaos that persists to this day. First, there was a mutiny of the Force Publique. The Force Publique was the colonial army Belgium created when the Congo was under their rule. The purpose of that army was to maintain Belgium's control over the Congo and to quash any resistance. As a result, while there were Congolese soldiers in the army, they were barred from any position of power or authority within the army. That was all reserved for the white Europeans. The problem was that when the Congo declared their independence, this army remained unchanged. But on July 5, 1960, just days after declaring independence, the Congolese soldiers demanded equality within the army, and that the army now align itself with the Free Congo, not Belgium. When those demands were made, a Belgian officer told them, before independence equals after independence. In other words, ain't shit changing. But the Congolese soldiers were not going for that, so they rebelled. And so begun the mutiny, which provided Belgium the opportunity to send more troops to the Congo under the guise of protecting the Europeans. And when it rains, it pours, because what happened next was the Katanga secession. Moise Tshombe was what we call anarch. He was a Katangan businessman who opposed independence, and Patrice Lumumba specifically, because he opposed communism in fear that Lumumba would nationalize the industries that made the province of Katanga, and Moise specifically, very rich. Katanga was a province within the Congo that was rich in copper, cobalt, uranium, and industrial minerals, most of which was profiting Belgium and some Congolese businessmen like Moise. But if Lumumba nationalized these industries, Belgium and people like Moise would lose the disproportionate control and gains they've been receiving. So just days after the Congo declared its independence, Moise Tshombe declared that Katanga was independent, meaning they were seceding from the Congo. Because Belgium and Moise were aligned, they backed his secession, and the UN refused Lumumba's pleas for help stopping the Katangan secession, leaving him with no other choice but to turn to the Soviet Union for help, which immediately made him an enemy of the Western empires, like the United States, who were in the middle of the Cold War and a quest to stamp out communism. So what happened next was a Belgian, Britain, and US CIA-backed coup, led by Joseph Désiré Mobutu. And in December of 1960, they captured Patrice Lumumba. By January 1961, he was dead. Patrice Lumumba was executed by Katangan officials in the presence of Belgian soldiers. At Mobutu's direction, they tortured Patrice Lumumba. They made him eat the paper his Independence Day speech was written on, and they executed him by firing squad. Then, when they were done massacring his body with bullets, they dissolved his body in sulfuric acid. The only thing that remained of the first democratically elected Prime Minister of the Democratic Republic of the Congo was a single tooth that was not returned to his family until 2022. Patrice Lumumba was assassinated by imperialist nations who saw him as a threat to imperial rule. Patrice Lumumba wanted a free Africa, financial independence for the Congo, to be free of European influence, interference, and theft, and he wanted to nationalize their industries so that all Congolese people could benefit instead of only a few. So he was a threat they had removed, and the Congo has never recovered from that interference and destabilization, because that was the intention. In 1965, with the help of the US, Mobutu seized control of the Congo and began a Western-backed dictatorship that renamed the country Zaire and lasted for more than 3 decades until Mobutu's fall in 1997. But the Congo remains fragile, unstable, war-stricken by armed militias who fight for the country's wealth of resources, and drained by the Western nations who continue to use the Congo's resources for their own industries. Millions of Congolese people have died and been killed, and millions of Congolese people live in crisis, suffering from famine, violence, physical displacement, and so much more, because imperialist nations refused to allow African people to profit from their own wealth and to self-govern free of interference. But none of what's transpired would have been surprising to Patrice Lumumba. First, he knew he would be killed. He said as much in a letter he wrote to his wife from prison after he was captured. In that letter, he said, "My dear wife, I am writing these words to you, not knowing whether they will ever reach you, or whether I should be alive when you read them. Throughout my struggle for the independence of our country, I have never doubted the victory of our sacred cause, to which I and my comrades have dedicated all of our lives. But the only thing which we wanted for our country is the right to a worthy life, to dignity without pretense, to independence without restriction. This was never the desire of the Belgian colonialists and the Western allies who received, direct or indirect, open or concealed, support from some highly placed officials of the United Nations, the body upon which we placed all of our hope when we appealed to it for help. They seduced some of our compatriots, bought others, and did everything to distort the truth and smear our independence. What I can say is this: alive or dead, free or in jail, it is not a question of me personally. The main thing is the Congo, our unhappy people, whose independence is being trampled upon. That is why they have shut us away in prison, and why they keep us far away from the people. But my faith remains indestructible. I know and feel deep in my heart that sooner or later, my people will rid themselves of their internal and external enemies, that they will rise up as one in order to say no to colonialism, to brazen, dying colonialism, in order to win their dignity in a clean land. We are not alone. Africa, Asia, the free peoples, and the peoples fighting for their freedom in all corners of the world will always be side by side with the millions of Congolese who will not give up the struggle while there is even one colonialist or colonialist mercenary in our country. To my sons, whom I am leaving, and whom perhaps I shall not see again, I want to say that the future of the Congo is splendid, and that I expect from them, as from every Congolese, the fulfillment of the sacred task of restoring our independence and our sovereignty. Without dignity, there is no freedom. Without justice, there is no dignity. And without independence, there are no free men. Cruelty, insults, and torture can never force me to ask for mercy, because I prefer to die with head high, with indestructible faith and profound belief in the destiny of our country, than to live in humility and renounce the principles which are sacred to me. The day will come when history will speak, but it will not be the history which will be taught in Brussels, Paris, Washington, or the United Nations. It will be the history which will be taught in the countries which have won freedom from colonialism and its puppets. Africa will write its own history, and in both North and South, it will be a history of glory and dignity. Do not weep for me. I know that my tormented country will be able to defend its freedom and its independence. Long live the Congo, long live Africa. From Paisville Prison, Patrice Lumumba. And Patrice didn't just anticipate his own fate. He always knew what would come of not just the Congo, but Africa and African people all over the globe if the Congo was allowed to perish at the hands of imperialism. In a speech he delivered at the All-African Conference in Leopoldville, the site of the uprising that led to the Congo's independence, just about a month before he delivered his independence speech, Patrice Lumumba said this: "All of them, fighting for African unity, have said no to the strangulation of Africa. All of them immediately realized that the attempts of the imperialists to restore their rule threatened not only the independence of the Congo, but also the existence of all the independent states of Africa. They all realized that if the Congo perishes, the whole of Africa will be plunged into the gloom of defeat and bondage. That is further striking proof of African unity. It is concrete testimony of the unity that we need in the face of imperialism's monstrous appetite. All statesmen are agreed that this reality is not debated, but fought for so that it may be defended. We have gathered here in order that together we may defend Africa, our patrimony. In reply to the actions of the imperialist states, for whom Belgium is only an instrument, we must unite the resistant front of the free and fighting nations of Africa. We must oppose the enemies of freedom with a coalition of free men. Our common destiny is now being decided here in the Congo. It is in effect here that the last act of Africa's emancipation and rehabilitation is being played, and extending the struggle whose primary object was to save the dignity of the African. The Congolese people have chosen independence. In doing so, they were aware that a single blow would not free them from colonial fetters, that judicial independence was only the first step, that a further long and trying effort would be required. The road we have chosen is not an easy one, but it is the road of pride and freedom of man. We are aware that as long as the country was dependent, as long as she did not take her destiny into her own hands, the main thing would be lacking. This concerns all other colonies, no matter what their standard of life is or what positive aspects of the colonial system they have. We have declared our desire for speedy independence without a transition period and without compromises with such emphasis because we have suffered more mockery, insults, and humiliation than anybody else. What purpose could delays serve when we already knew that sooner or later we would have to revise and re-examine everything? We had to create a new system adapted to the requirements of purely African evolution, change the methods forced on us, and in particular, find ourselves and free ourselves from the mental attitudes and various complexes in which colonization kept us for centuries. We were offered a choice between liberation and the continuation of bondage. There can be no compromise between freedom and slavery. We chose to pay the price of freedom. The classical methods of the colonialists, which we all knew or partially still know, are particularly vital here. Survivals of military occupation and tribal disunity sustained and encouraged over a long period, and destructive political opposition planned, directed, and paid. You know how difficult it has been for a newly independent state to get rid of the military bases installed by the former occupying powers. We must declare here and now that henceforth, Africa refuses to maintain the armed forces of the imperialists in its territory. We have our own armies to defend our country. Our armed forces, which are victims of machinations, are likewise freeing themselves from the colonial organization in order to have all the qualities of a national army under Congolese leadership. Our internal difficulties, tribal war and the nuclei of political opposition, seem to have been accidentally concentrated in the regions with our richest mineral and power resources. We know how all this was organized, and in particular, who supports it today in our house. Our Katanga, because of its uranium, copper, and gold, and our Bakwanga and Kasai, because of its diamonds, have become hotbeds of imperialist intrigue. The object of these intrigue is to recapture economic control of our country. But one thing is certain, and I solemnly declare that the Congolese people will never again let themselves be exploited, that all leaders who will strive to direct them to that road will be thrown out the community. The resonance that has now been caused by the Congolese problem shows the weight that Africa has in the world today. Our countries, which only yesterday they wanted to ignore as colonial countries, are today causing the old world concern here in Africa. Let them worry about what belongs to them. That is not our affair. Our future, our destiny, a free Africa is our affair. This is our year, which you have witnessed and shared in. It is the year of our undisputed victory. It is the year of heroic, blood-drenched Algeria, of Algeria the martyr and example of struggle. It is the year of tortured Angola, of enslaved South Africa, of imprisoned Rwanda-Urundi, of humiliated Kenya. We all know, and the world knows it, that Algeria is not French, that Angola is not Portuguese, that Kenya is not English, that Rwanda-Urundi is not Belgian. We know that Africa is neither French, nor British, nor America, nor Russian. It is African. We know the objects of the West. Yesterday, they divided us on the level of a tribe, clan, and village. Today, with Africa liberating herself, They seek to divide us on the level of the states. They want to create antagonistic blocs, satellites, and having begun from that stage of the Cold War to deepen the division in order to perpetuate their rule. Patrice Lumumba and other African leaders knew exactly what Western imperialist nations would do, how they would do it, why they would do it, and who of their own they would use to do it. Because what happened in the Congo wasn't random. It wasn't unexpected. This is a blueprint that has been established since Haiti. But just as Toussaint Louverture knew killing him could not kill the movement, that more revolutionaries would spring up in his place, so too did Patrice Lumumba know that killing him would not put a stop to the mission for a free Africa. After Patrice Lumumba was executed, Kwame Nkrumah, president of Ghana, spoke so powerfully about how Patrice Lumumba was betrayed and murdered by the United Nations and what it meant for the entirety of Africa, that it's necessary we hear every single word.
Countrymen, African freedom fighters, comrades and friends, somewhere in Katanga, in the Congo, where and when, we do not know, 3 of our brother freedom fighters have been done to death. There have been killed Patrice Lumumba, the Prime Minister of the Republic of the Congo, Maurice Bishop, the minister in his government who was elected from Katanga province, and Joseph Okito, the Vice President of the Congolese Senate. About their end, many things are uncertain, but one fact is crystal clear. They have been killed because the United Nations, whom Patrice Lumumba himself, as Prime Minister, had invited to the Congo to preserve law and order, not only failed to maintain that law and order, but also denied to the lawful government of the Congo all other means of self-protection. History recalls many occasions when rulers of states have been assassinated. The murder of Patrice Lumumba and of his 2 colleagues, however, is unique in that this is the first time in history that the legal ruler of a country has been done to death with the open connivance of a world organization in whom that ruler put his trust. These are the facts. Patrice Lumumba was appointed Prime Minister by the departing Belgian authorities because he was the leader of the parliamentary party with the largest representation and was the only member of parliament who could obtain a majority in both the Senate and the Chamber. Kasavubu was subsequently elected as the ceremonial head of the state, but it was clearly agreed and understood that he should have no more authority or power than has the King of the Belgians in Belgium. This fact, clearly written into the Constitution of the Congo, has been deliberately ignored and distorted by those who have sought for their own ends to give some appearance of legality to the military usurpers and the agents of colonial rule who have illegally seized power in some parts of the Congo. Shortly after independence, the Congolese army mutinied. Patrice Lumumba and his colleagues had to secure outside support from somewhere if they were to preserve the legal structure of the state. In the interest of world peace, and in order to prevent the Cold War being brought into Africa, Patrice Lumumba invited the United Nations to preserve law and order. The United Nations insisted that they should have the sole mandate to do this, and that the legal government of the Congo should not obtain that military assistance, which would have otherwise been forthcoming from many other friendly African states. However, instead of preserving law and order, the United Nations declared itself neutral between law and disorder and refused to lend any assistance whatsoever to the legal government in suppressing the mutineers who have set themselves up in power in Katanga and South Kasai. When, in order to move its troops against the rebels, the government of the Congo obtained some civilian aircraft and civilian motor vehicles from the Soviet Union, the colonialist powers at the United Nations raised a howl of rage, while at the same time maintaining a discreet silence over the build-up of Belgian arms and actual Belgian military forces in the service of the rebels. With a total disregard of the Constitution, which expressly provided that the President could not dismiss the Prime Minister unless there had been a vote of no confidence in the Parliament. Kasavubu illegally tried to remove Patrice Lumumba from office and to substitute another government. When Lumumba wished to broadcast to the people, explaining what had happened, the United Nations, in the so-called interest of law and order, prevented him by force from speaking. They did not, however, use the same force to prevent the mutineers of the Congolese army from seizing power in Libreville and installing a completely illegal government. Despite the fact that one of the most important reasons for the United Nations action was supposedly to see that all Belgian forces were removed, the United Nations sat by while the so-called Katanga government, which is entirely Belgian-controlled, imported aircraft and arms from Belgium and from other countries, such as South Africa, which have a vested interest in the suppression of African freedom. The United Nations connived at the setting up, in fact, of an independent, though this is contrary to the Security Council's own resolutions. Finally, the United Nations, which could exert its authority to prevent Patrice Lumumba from broadcasting, was, so it pleaded, quite unable to prevent his arrest by mutineers or his transfer through the use of airfields under United Nations control into the hands of the Belgian-dominated government of Katanga. The United Nations is, on behalf of all its members, in control of the finances of the Congo. It is now 2 months ago since I personally wrote to Mr. Hamishot to ask him where the money came from which is being used to pay the soldiers in Mobutu's illegal army. I am still awaiting an answer. One thing is certain, however, this money does not come from the revenue of the Congo. It is supplied from outside by those who wish to restore colonialism in practice by maintaining in office a puppet regime entirely financially dependent upon them. The time has come to speak plainly. The danger in the Congo is not so much the possibility of a civil war between Africans, but rather a colonialist war in which the colonial and imperialist powers hide behind African puppet regimes. At this very moment, northern Katanga is being laid waste by military units under command of a regular officer of the Belgian army, Colonel Krabaka, armed with the most modern weapons supplied by Belgium. Recruiting offices have been opened in South Africa, in France, and elsewhere, and wages of over £400 a month are being offered to former German fascist officers and to former collaborators of Hitler and Mussolini in other countries in order to persuade them to enlist in an unholy war against the African people. Where, I ask again, does the money come from to pay these big salaries and to buy all of this modern and expensive armament which is now being deployed against unarmed peasants and villagers? The rulers of the United States, of the United Kingdom, of France, and of the other powers who are militarily allied with Belgium must answer these questions. Why did they express so loudly their indignation when the Soviet Union placed at the disposal of the legal government of the Congo civilian aircraft and civilian vehicles? Why are they so silent when their ally Belgium openly supplies military aircraft and armored vehicles to the rebels? Why is it that no single member of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization has on any occasion addressed to Belgium any public rebuke for the flagrant breaches of the Security Council resolutions in which Belgium is every day indulging? Alas, the architects of this murder are many. In Ghana, we realize the great financial stakes which some great powers have in the Union Miniere and in other industrial and commercial undertakings in the Congo. I would, however, ask these powers these questions. Do they really believe that ultimately they can safeguard their investments and their interests in the Congo by conniving at a brutal and savage colonialist war? Do they realize that they are sacrificing African lives to continue in Africa the Cold War at the very time when all powers, both great and small, should be concentrating on the abolition of colonialism and the establishment of world peace? Patrice Lumumba, Maurice Bishop, and Joseph Okito have died because they put their faith in the United Nations and because they refused to allow themselves to be used as stooges or puppets for external interests. Our dear brothers, Patrice Lumumba, Maurice Bishop, and Joseph Okita are dead. And I ask you all to join with me in mourning the loss which the whole of African continent has sustained through their cruel murder. But their spirit is not dead, nor are the things for which they stood: African freedom, the unity and independence of Africa, and the final and complete destruction of colonialism and imperialism. The colonialists and imperialists have killed them. But what they cannot do is to kill the ideals which we will still preach and for which they sacrifice their lives. In the Africa of the future, their names will live forevermore.
It's almost time to travel to Burkina Faso to learn about Thomas Sankara. But first, let's talk about Upper Volta. What we know today as Burkina Faso was once called Upper Volta, a name given to it by the French who'd colonized this West African nation. Upper Volta was unlike Haiti, who was the crown jewel of the French Empire, or the Congo, who was that of Belgium. Upper Volta was more like my Bahama land, in that not all colonies are made equal in the eyes of the colonizers who define our nations purely by how we can benefit them and what resources they can extract. The Bahamas was originally colonized by Spain, before eventually being colonized by Britain, but history took note of both empires' disappointment in the Bahamas as a resource. In 1492, when Christopher Columbus came upon an island in the Bahamas that is today called San Salvador, Spain was excited to enslave the indigenous Lucayan people, the Arawaks, and force them to work on large-scale plantations, but were disappointed to discover that Bahamian soil was too thin for the kind of massively profitable plantations they'd had in mind. Although they decided that the Bahamas itself was not of much value to them, they still enslaved the entire population of indigenous people and sent them to then Hispaniola to work on those plantations. They removed all of the people from our country, then they pretty much abandoned the Bahamas for another century until Britain seized control. Britain was also disappointed to learn that Bahamian soil couldn't sustain the large lucrative plantations they'd created in Jamaica and Barbados. As Spain had done a century earlier, Britain too had pretty much neglected and abandoned the islands of the Bahamas, leaving us to be overrun by pirates but not giving us our freedom. It wasn't until Britain discovered that the Bahamas' value to them was not in our soil or natural resources, but as a shipping route for trade and as a means to carry out the slave trade that they took an interest in the Bahamas. The Bahamas was an essential spot in the Middle Passage, which was the name given to the route taken to transport enslaved Africans to the Caribbean and the Americas. So despite the limited profitability of Bahamian plantations, that didn't stop Britain from bringing enslaved Africans to the Bahamas to work on plantations until 1834, when slavery was abolished, and retaining control of the Bahamas until we gained our independence in 1973. And it's those enslaved Africans from whom today's Bahamians descend. Similarly to the Bahamas, Burkina Faso, then Upper Volta, was not valued by the French. It wasn't rich in natural resources or minerals that could be mined, and the land made it too difficult to grow and export crops. But unlike the Bahamas, Burkina Faso was landlocked without much coastal access, so that didn't make them ideal for trade either. But just like Spain had done to the Bahamas, the French found other uses for the colony. Like Spain had done to the indigenous Lucayans of the Bahamas, who they had enslaved and sent to Hispaniola, the French enslaved the people of Upper Volta and forced them to do labor in plantations elsewhere, as well as they were forced to do all kinds of other government-mandated labor for France. Even once slavery was technically abolished in Upper Volta in the 1940s, the system remained in place because they were still forced to do labor at the threat of violence, imprisonment, and taxation. And just like Belgium did to the Congo, the people of Upper Volta were denied access to education, positions of power, and their own cultural practices. But unlike the Congo that was rich in resources and whose independence brought about an ongoing violent fight for control of those resources by Western empires, when Upper Volta gained their independence the same year as the Congo in 1960, Upper Volta became dependent on foreign aid. The country also experienced several coups and was ruled by different military elites. That is the Upper Volta that Thomas Sankara was born into, and would eventually rename Burkina Faso when he became president through a revolutionary military coup in 1983 at just 33 years old. The reason Thomas Sankara renamed Upper Volta Burkina Faso was because it means land of the upright people. Thomas Sankara had become president of a nation who'd been forced to be dependent on imperialist nations, but he wanted to put an end to that.
Produit suffisamment de quoi nous nourrir. Nous pouvons dépasser même notre production, malheureusement. Par manque d'organisation, nous sommes encore obligés de tendre la main pour demander des aides alimentaires. Ces aides alimentaires qui nous bloquent, qui nous inspirent, qui installent dans nos esprits cette habitude, ces réflexes de mendiant, d'assister. Nous devons mettre de côté ces aides par notre grande production. Il faut réussir à produire plus. Produire plus. Produire plus parce que il est normal que celui qui vous donne à manger vous dicte également ses volontés. Nous consommons que ce que nous contrôlons.
But Thomas Sankara didn't just want to put an end to Burkina Faso being dependent on imperialist nations. He wanted to put an end to imperialism, and it's that made him a threat.
Il y en a qui demandent mais où se trouve l'impérialisme? L'impérialisme, regardez dans vos assiettes quand vous mangez les grains de riz, de maïs, de mil importés. C'est ça l'impérialisme. N'allez pas plus loin. N'allons pas plus loin.
Like Lumumba's August 1960 address made clear that he anticipated exactly how imperialism would retaliate, so too did Thomas Sankara in a speech he delivered on March 26, 1983, when he declared that their greatest enemy and impediment to success as a nation was imperialism. In that speech, he said, "When the people stand up, imperialism trembles. As it watches us, imperialism is worried. It trembles." Even now, imperialism is wondering how to break the ties being forged between the CSP and the people. Imperialism is trembling. It is trembling with fear because here in this very town of Ouagadougou, we are going to bury it. What is our purpose here? Our purpose is to tell you exactly what our enemies want, what the CSP wants, and what you, the people, have a right to. The people love liberty and democracy and will thus combat all enemies of liberty and democracy. But who are these enemies of the people? The enemies of the people here inside the country are all those who have illicitly taken advantage of their social position and their place in the bureaucracy to enrich themselves. By means of bribery, maneuvers, and forged documents, they have become shareholders in different companies. They are now involved in financing businesses and obtaining approval for this or that enterprise in the guise of helping Upper Volta. These are the enemies of the people. They must be exposed. They must be combated. We will combat them with you. Who are the enemies of the people? They are that group of bourgeoisie who enrich themselves dishonestly through fraud and bribery, through the corruption of state officials. These are the enemies of the people. This section of the bourgeoisie must be fought against, and we will fight against it. Who are the enemies of the people? They are the men in politics who travel through the countryside exclusively at election time. The enemies of the people are likewise those who keep us in ignorance. Under the cover of spiritual guidance and tradition, they exploit the people instead of serving their real spiritual needs and their real social interests. They must be fought against, and we will fight them. The enemies of the people are also beyond our borders. Their base is among unpatriotic people here in our midst at every level of society. Civilian and military men, men and women, old and young, in town and country alike. These enemies are neo-colonialism and imperialism. You see, imperialism is wrong, but imperialism is a bad student. Even though it's been defeated, though it's been sent out of the classroom, it comes back again. It's a bad student because imperialism never draws the lessons from its failures. It's down in South Africa, cutting African throats just because Africans there are thinking about freedom as you are today. Imperialism is down there crushing the Arab people. That's Zionism. Imperialism is everywhere, making us think like it, submit to it, and go along with its maneuvers by spreading its culture far and wide with the help of misinformation. We must bar the road to this imperialism. As I said, it will proceed to a violent stage. It is this imperialism that landed troops in certain countries we know. Imperialism armed those who are killing our brothers in South Africa. Imperialism again is the assassin of the Lumumbas, Cabrals, and Kwame Nkrumahs. But I'll tell you something. In fact, I'll promise you, because I have confidence in you and you have confidence in the CSP, that thanks to the education we will give our people, when this imperialism comes here, we will bury it. We will bury it right here. Like Patrice Lumumba, Thomas Sankara was a Pan-African anti-imperialist. Sankara was also a Marxist, a label Patrice Lumumba didn't claim, but was placed on him anyway by the Western powers who saw his policies and desired to nationalize industries as communist. But unlike Patrice Lumumba, who'd risen to power through the first democratically held election in the Congo, Thomas Sankara was a member of the Upper Volta military who had become president through a military coup that was led by his friend and ally Blaise Compaoré. After Sankara had been arrested and imprisoned by the then president, a more conservative military leader who had appointed Sankara as prime minister in January 1983, before quickly regretting his decision after an April meeting with French leaders where Sankara condemned imperialism, Western intervention, and made clear that Upper Volta would align with their own interests, not France's. That meeting, in addition to Sankara's rising grassroots popularity, the elite opposition to his anti-corruption stance, and pressure from France who feared that he would demand true independence for Upper Volta's president placed him under house arrest. But predictably, this invigorated the movement they aimed to crush and led Blaise Compaoré to stage a coup and free Sankara. Upper Volta had experienced several coups led by military elite, but this one was different. And Thomas Sankara spoke to what made it different. In the speech he delivered on March 26, 1983, he said, "For the first time in Upper Volta, something fundamental is happening, something completely new. Until now, the people have never had the power to establish political democracy. While the army has always had the possibility of taking power, it has never wanted democracy. For the first time, we see an army that wants both power and democracy, and that is genuinely seeking to ally with the people. For the first time, too, we see the massives come out in impressive numbers and reach out to the army. We believe this army, which is taking the destiny of the Voltaic people in its hands, is the people's army. This is why I welcome the placards here that talk of the people's army." Every word out of Thomas Sankara's mouth, every plan he had for Burkina Faso, and every policy he implemented was a threat to imperialism. He believed in economic sovereignty, cultural sovereignty, anti-corruption, and women's rights. He was a foundational champion of women's rights. Here are some of the many policies that Thomas Sankara implemented and positions he took to revolutionize Burkina Faso. He reduced reliance on IMF and the World Bank. He rejected foreign aid dependency. He encouraged domestic food production. He promoted local industry and consumption. He redistributed land from feudal landlords to peasants. He led massive vaccination campaigns. He planted millions of trees to combat desertification. He sold off the government Mercedes. He drove him a very modest Renault 5. He cut official salaries. He lived modestly. He appointed women to high government positions. He banned female genital mutilation. He banned forced marriages. He encouraged women to work. He instituted a men go to market day to confront domestic labor inequality. And in addition to renaming Upper Volta Burkina Faso, he changed national symbols and he promoted traditional African clothing. Not only did he do those things, he successfully did those things. And just as Lumumba taught us, the struggles and successes of African nations are indivisible. If Burkina Faso thrived, so too could other African nations. Which is why, as Thomas Sankara predicted, imperialism lives in and outside of the country, and it never learns a lesson from its failures. It returns, and it returns with violence. On October 15, 1987, Thomas Sankara, along with 12 other colleagues, were killed in a coup led by his closest ally, the man who led the coup that made him president, Blaise Compaoré. Blaise Compaoré is suspected but not proven to have been working either directly with the French or with Côte d'Ivoire under President Félix Houphouët-Boigny, who aligned with France to assassinate and overthrow Sankara. It's also suspected that Compaoré had grown jealous of Sankara's rising popularity and how he had become the face of a coup that Compaoré led, and that he'd become ideologically opposed to Sankara, who he had come to feel was too radical, too anti-elite, too anti-corruption, too anti-imperialist, and doing too much too fast. What we know for a fact is that Compaoré executed Sankara, seized control of Burkina Faso, undid most of what Sankara had implemented, re-established dependency on IMF institutions and allegiances to France, and he ruled for almost 30 years until he had to flee the country after attempting to amend the constitution to extend his rule. Since then, Burkina Faso has had several military coups, remains politically unstable, and one of the poorest countries in Africa. Now it's time to head to the Caribbean, more specifically, the island of Grenada, to learn more about the Grenadian Revolution and one of its most prominent figures, Maurice Bishop.
The Caribbean is a region of many cultures and peoples who share a common history. Grenada, Carriacou, and Petite Martinique make up a small country in the Caribbean Sea. The country's 110,000 people are mostly of African descent. They took control of their lives and their future through a revolution on March 13, 1979, the first revolution in the English-speaking Caribbean.
If we are going to talk about the revolution in Grenada, first of all, there was no freedom. There was definitely a government that was in power to keep down each and every person in this island that had the ability or the ambition to go forward, lift the head above the water.
Before we can discuss Maurice Bishop, his rise to power, the 1979 Grenadian Revolution that made him prime minister, and the fall of that revolution, I have to take you back to what's referred to as the 1951 revolution in Grenada. Joseph Ewart Lane was one of the 17 men who was eventually imprisoned for his role in the Grenadian Revolution and Maurice Bishop's execution after the US invaded. He was imprisoned for 26 years, and while in prison, he wrote the book We Move Tonight, The Making of the Grenada Revolution. In that book, he explained how the New Jewel movement and the revolution they led was connected to the 1951 revolution. He said, up until 1951, agriculture was the dominant prospering sector of Grenada's economy. Prospering, that is, for the planter class of Grenada and the British colonial systems. But in 1951, the agricultural workers rose up against the planter class in British colonial control. For 100 years since the emancipation from slavery, in 1838, the wages of generations of agricultural workers remained relatively unchanged. After 1940, small wage increases were granted, but it was too little too late. By 1951, labor oppression combined with the aspirations for improvement among agricultural workers on the estates, the hope for improvement aroused by the small wage increases of the previous decade, and further inspired by the labor struggles in other Caribbean islands, all served to form a powder keg in Grenada, just waiting for ignition. In 1950, a 29-year-old Grenadian who had been active in the labor movement in the oil belt of the Dutch Antilles returned to Grenada. His name was Eric Gary. He met a situation waiting for leadership and offering the possibility for satisfying his ambition to obtain a political mass base and political power. Gary formed a labor union, the Grenada Manual and Mental Workers Union. into which he unionized Grenada's 10,000 agricultural workers, spread on many estates all around Grenada. He began to champion their cause for higher wages and better working conditions, and to challenge the planter class. At first, he was branded a communist and was ignored by the planters, but he kept up the struggle. Finally, in 1951, the situation erupted. The keg exploded. Widespread protests broke out on the estates. During what has become known as the 1951 Revolution, agricultural workers burned and destroyed estates and installations, schools, medical centers, the governor's beach house, symbols of colonial dominance in the island. Anger pent up over 100 years against ruthless economic exploitation, deprivation of political power, and colonial oppression burst its dam. The British responded in the usual manner. Military and paramilitary forces were brought in from Barbados, St. Vincent, and neighboring islands in an effort to quell the uprising, but they met with little success. Gary was arrested and taken on a British warship. This too failed to quell the uprising. Recognizing that rather than serving to arrest the situation, the use of force had fueled the uprising, the British finally played the compromise card. A leading British official who came to Grenada and met with Gary assessed him as a demagogue and an egoist, whose main interest was personal power, and who was capable of being bought and manipulated. He proposed that a compromise be struck with Gary. This compromise finally brought an end to the uprising. Out of that 1951 struggle, agricultural workers won substantial improvements in their daily wages and working conditions. Also, very importantly, they won for themselves a sense of dignity and respect as they forced the planters and the British to back down for the first time ever. The 1951 experience proved that rights could be won through struggle. With the attainment of adult suffrage, party politics was introduced to Grenada. In 1951, Gary formed his Grenada United Labour Party. In the 1951 general elections, the first held in Grenada under the conditions of adult suffrage, the Gulf won the majority of the seats in Parliament. Gary thus emerged as the first black man to be a leader in Grenada, where about 90% of the population was and still remains black. But no sooner had Gary gained control of the country's finances that he and his cohorts began a pattern of misuse of public finances and corruption. Despite the fact that Eric Gary had championed workers and the people of Grenada, had fought and won them rights, sat at the helm of the fight that gained them independence, and come into power through the support of the agricultural working class who supported him. Once in power, he appointed only the bourgeoisie, engaged in so much corruption, and lined his and his bourgeoisie friends' pockets with so much money they stole from the Grenadian people that it became known as squander mania. And as criticism and opposition to his corruption grew louder, Gary became violent and increasingly more authoritarian. He fired anybody in his administration who spoke ill of him, and he used police to beat people into submission. Gary's corruption made way for the emergence of an opposing party, and so came the New Jewel movement in 1973. The New Jewel movement was formed on March 11, 1973. They were led by Maurice Bishop, a Marxist and Pan-African Grenadian lawyer, and Bernard Cord, a Marxist and Pan-African Grenadian university professor. The New Jewel movement was birthed out of an organization that Maurice Bishop had created called the Movement for Assemblies of the People, MAP, an organization whose primary focus had been supplying its members and Grenadian youth with revolutionary education, and of which both Bishop and Cord had been members, as well as many of the initial members of the New Jewel movement. The New Jewel movement demanded change for the working class people of Grenada, an end to corruption, and the end of Eric Gary's dictatorship. According to Joseph Lane's We Move Tonight, within weeks of its formation, the New Jewel movement established itself firmly as the most vibrant and leading political force in Grenada in opposition to Gary. It led the people in a mass protest action against Gary. The action was sparked off when Jeremiah Richardson, a youth from St. Andrew, was shot dead by Gary's police on April 20th, 1973. Within hours, New Jewel movement leaders were on the spot in St. Andrew. Thousands threw in their support and protest in the next 3 days. They marched to Pearls Airport, then the only airport in Grenada, where Jeremiah Richardson had been a worker, and they shut it down. That shutdown, which lasted for 2 days, was the incident which first brought the Grenadian struggle into regional and international spotlight, as no aircraft could either arrive or leave Grenada. So much of the New Jewel movement's origins, approach to mobilization and political education, share similarities with the Black Panther Party and its leaders and strategies in America. Both the New Jewel movement and the Black Panther Party were revolutionary organizations that prioritized the working class, political education, education, Black political consciousness, community chapters, armed self-defense, socialist thought, Marxist principles, and community programs. The Black Panther Party emerged in 1966 in opposition to police brutality, corruption, and in a quest for Black power and self-determination. They'd been inspired by Malcolm X, anti-colonialism, and Marxism. The New Jewel movement, from very early, outlined its policies in the now famous New Jewel Movement Manifesto. The manifesto was written in the months of July and August 1973. Its main authors were Maurice Bishop and Bernard Cord. In its political aspect, the manifesto advocated the establishment of people's power through grassroots democracy in the form of assemblies of the people to be based in all villages of Grenada. And in its economic aspect, it advocated national development along non-capitalist lines. Like the New Jewel Movement created their New Jewel Movement Manifesto, the Black Panther Party created the 10-point program, which laid out explicitly the goals of the party, a few of which was the power to determine the destiny of our Black community and an end to capitalism's theft from the Black community. In November 1973, the young New Jewel movement produced its first major challenge for power to the Gary dictatorship. On the 4th of November, the New Jewel movement held its historic People's Congress. Over 10,000 Grenadians, or about 20% of the adult population, turned out to that People's Congress. There, the leaders presented the manifesto to the Grenadian people, and it was adopted by the People's Congress as the program for bringing genuine independence to Grenada. A people's indictment was also presented against the dictator. The indictment contained 27 counts, ranging from murder to embezzlement of public funds. Bishop and Cord, combining their legal and political skills, drafted this indictment. The People's Congress found Gary guilty on all 27 counts as charged, and he was given 2 weeks, 14 days, to give up the reins of power. Gary responded to this challenge with violence. On the 18th of November, the deadline for Gary's resignation, 6 leaders of the New Jewel movement were attacked by his thugs and were battered. That day is now recorded in Grenada's history as Bloody Sunday. Those most severely brutalized on that day were Maurice Bishop, Unison Whiteman, and Sylvan Strong. After being battered, they were thrown in a cell. The next day, in their battered state, the New Jewel Movement 6 were taken before a magistrate, who promptly packed them off to prison, denying them bail to which they were entitled given the nature of the charges against them, and they received no medical care for their manifest injuries. Far from controlling the restiveness in the country, the brutalization of the New Jewel Movement 6 exacerbated the situation. In a show of national unity, urban workers, farmers, businessmen, students, and the churches protested against the police brutality. Workers spontaneously took strike action, students refused to go to school, dock workers closed down the only port in Grenada, and anti-Gary demonstrations broke out. Gary had clearly overplayed his hand. Despite this uprising that managed to bring as many as 25,000 Grenadians into the street to support the New Jewel movement and oppose Gary in 1973 and 1974, Gary did manage to crush that resistance. He sent police into the streets to attack those 25,000 Grenadians, and in the course of this, the police murdered Maurice Bishop's father. The New Jewel movement's 1974 failures led to mass disillusionment that almost crushed the movement. But just as the Black Panther Party's Huey Newton had revisited their failures and restructured how the party had to function within their communities in order to be effective, so too did Bernard Cord, who determined that the New Jewel movement failed to bring about the revolution in 74 because they weren't organized enough. Their internal structure was too loose, as were their links with the people. He argued that although they had achieved the support of the population's majority and managed to bring 25,000 Grenadians into the street, once Gary crushed the protests and those people went home, no structure existed to get in touch with or to activate those people. So they needed to transform the party into one that had day-to-day links with the masses. This was not unlike the Black Panther Party, who organized community chapters and things like their breakfast programs in order to cement themselves within their communities.
All culture are different things we want to form. Normalize the people, teach, learn for myself, the youth, the old, the young, in education, all such of things that will be helped to build the revolution.
Cord built a program to restructure the New Jewel movement and successfully rolled it out gradually over the course of 2 years. Although the New Jewel movement's initial attempt at revolution failed, in 1979, when Gary was out of the country, the New Jewel movement took that opportunity to execute a bloodless coup where they seized control of Grenada. Maurice Bishop became prime minister and Bernard Cord became deputy prime minister. An explosion took place in the Caribbean on March 13, 1979. A grenade detonated. Revolution erupted in the then unknown islands of Grenada. So earth-shattering was its effects that it shook the entire Caribbean region and the Americas. So loud was the explosion that it was heard in every corner in the globe. In the US, President Carter convened a meeting of his National Security Council. The CIA scrambled to gather information on the Caribbean, and more specifically Grenada. For many years, the CIA had shown benign neglect for the English-speaking Caribbean. Now suddenly, the region was elevated to the status of a hotspot. The first successful revolution ever to take place in the English-speaking Caribbean had burst onto the scene. The 4 years of Maurice Bishop's leadership following the Grenadian Revolution is considered one of the greatest moments in the country's history. He formed what was called the People's Revolutionary Government, and they created trade unions, youth groups, farmers groups, and women's organizations.
When we explain the gains of the revolution, to take them out of this old style, where they just come from their field, and from the field to their bed, after a while, people begin to understand that our lives don't have to be so hard. Things can change, you know.
Uprising! Gone are the days when our mothers and sisters were sex-exploited for jobs.
Today, the people are enjoying many more democratic rights and freedoms and are much more involved and participating in the building of our revolutionary process.
As Prime Minister, Maurice Bishop was not only loved for being extremely charismatic, but he expanded healthcare, labor rights, and education and literacy programs. He lowered job unemployment, he promoted women's political participation, and he created more training and childcare resources for women.
It is becoming more and more difficult for developing third world countries to go forward. Because unfortunately, our economies remain by and large dependent on and tied to the capitalist world economies. And therefore, when the capitalist world goes through their cyclical crises, one after the other, it has an immediate effect on us. As we say at home, when the capitalist world catches a cold, we catch pneumonia. And the crisis in the capitalist world has been deep. In all of the developed industrialized countries, there is greater and greater unemployment. And as this unemployment goes deeper and deeper into the society, the people who feel it the most are the poor and working people. The massive cutbacks. The massive cuts in social welfare, the cuts are not coming in the arms race. The cuts are not coming out of the arms budget. I understand the talk is to spend $3 trillion over 5 years. The mind boggles. That is the kind of money that is supposed to be consumed in arms. But while that kind of money is being consumed in arms, hospitals are closing down, jobs are being, more and more retrenchment is taking place, pensions are being reduced, medic aid is being reduced. In other words, the arms is swallowing up the money. The people are not benefiting.
Maurice Bishop also invested in infrastructure. Most notably, he began development of the second airport in Grenada, which is today called the Maurice Bishop International Airport. He created the airport to boost tourism in Grenada and to reduce economic dependence on the West. But because he created the airport with the help of Cuba and their leader, Fidel Castro, who he'd also developed a relationship with that allowed Cuban workers to come to Grenada as doctors, teachers, and construction workers, the United States, who innately considered the success of the Grenadian Revolution and Maurice Bishop's popularity in particular a threat, used the creation of this airport as means to paint Grenada as a communist foothold that was dangerous to them.
On June 5, 1983, Grenada's Prime Minister, Maurice Bishop, addressed an audience of some 3,000 people at Hunter College in New York City. Bishop was in the United States as part of his government's long-standing policy to normalize relations with the United States. But the Reagan administration, rather than consenting to meet with the Prime Minister, stepped up its attacks against Grenada, accusing the Bishop government of being a Soviet-Cuban pawn and a threat to democracy in the region.
The real reason for all of this hostility is because some perceive that what is happening in Grenada can lay the basis for a new socio-economic and political path of development. They give all kinds of reasons and excuses, some of them credible, some utter rubbish. There's an interesting one that we saw very recently in a secret report of the State Department. I want to tell you about that one, so you can reflect on that one. That secret report made this point, that Grenada is different to Cuba and Nicaragua, and the Grenada Revolution is in one sense even worse, I'm using their language, than the Cuban and Nicaraguan revolutions, because the people of Grenada and the leadership of Grenada speaks English and therefore can communicate directly to the people of the United States. But I want to tell you what that same report also said, and said that also made us very dangerous. And that is that the people of Grenada and the leadership of Grenada are predominantly black. They said that 95% of our population is black, and they had a correct statistic. And if we have 95% of predominantly African origin in our country, then we can have a dangerous appeal to 30 million black people in the United States.
Less than 5 months after his appearance at Hunter College, Maurice Bishop, a number of leading members of the New Jewel movement, and many Grenadan citizens were killed. 6 days later, following the executions and killings, 6,000 U.S. troops, supported by helicopter gunships, fighter aircraft, and a large naval task force from the world's most powerful nation, invaded Grenada, the smallest sovereign nation in the Western Hemisphere.
But it wasn't just the United States threatened by Maurice Bishop's leadership and popularity. Similarly to the fate of Burkina Faso's Thomas Sankara, who was killed in a coup led by his strongest ally, who'd once led a coup to free him and make him president. Or America's Malcolm X, who was murdered by fellow members of the Nation of Islam after ideological differences led to his departure from the organization. After 4 years of successful governance, Maurice Bishop was murdered in a coup led by his own deputy prime minister, the man who'd been his closest friend and co-architect of the New Jewel movement and its manifesto, Bernard Coard. Like it was suspected that jealousy, in addition to Western influence, motivated Compaoré to turn on Sankara in Burkina Faso, it's believed that Coard had grown jealous that the credit he felt due was given to Bishop for his charisma. And he believed that Bishop was not a rigid enough Marxist. Whatever the reason, tensions within the party formed and were exacerbated by paranoia over US interference, and the party split. Coard and other members of the New Jewel movement first placed Bishop under house arrest, but he was freed by mass protests from the Grenadian people. But still, they recaptured him. But this time, they executed him and 7 of their comrades, including Jacqueline Kreft, who was the Minister of Education and the mother of Maurice Bishop's child, by firing squad. And all this was in vain, because Coard intended to take control of Grenada, but what his actions made way for was a US invasion just days later, under the guise of protecting Americans who were there, that landed him and 16 other members of the New Jewel movement in prison for their role in their comrades' murders. Now it's time to travel to Guyana to meet Walter Rodney.
This evening, I'd like to welcome you to hear Walter Rodney, who will be speaking on crisis in the periphery of the world system, Africa and the Caribbean. Dr. Rodney is a historian, a political economist who's taught at the University of Dar es Salaam as well as the University of the West Indies and Cornell. He's lectured widely throughout the Caribbean, the United States, Africa, and Europe. He's also the author of How Europe Underdeveloped Africa and co-author of The Silent Class Struggle. In Guyana, he's a member of the Working People's Alliance, and without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Walter Rodney.
Walter Rodney was a Pan-African Marxist and student of the Caribbean Black Power movement. He was born in Guyana when it was still a British colony referred to as British Guyana. Walter Rodney went to the University of the West Indies in Jamaica on a scholarship and focused on African studies. He also completed his PhD in London. Before Rodney ever stepped into politics, Walter Rodney was a world-renowned scholar, and it was then that he first became a threat to empire, responsible for radicalizing masses to reject colonialism and capitalism and teaching the masses how the Caribbean struggle was linked to Africa and global Black liberation.
I have met brothers and sisters who say that their mother tongue, quote unquote, is French, Spanish, Dutch, Portuguese, as well as English, which we speak. And because of this, we have a problem of identification. We do not know whom we are. And that is why this gathering is of great symbolic importance, because it is an act of identification. We are saying that we identify with the African people of the African continent. We are saying that we are an African people. And when we make this identification, have no illusions about the fact that this is a very revolutionary initiative. It is a rejection of every other form of identification which the white society has asked us to accept. Let me draw your attention to something which white universities and white libraries practice. And this is a university community. Numerous universities lie around this land. Go into their libraries and check the Library of Congress card. Under Europe or Europeans, you will find all entries listed concerning the continent of Europe. You will also find entries listed about Europeans in East Africa, Europeans in North Africa, Europeans in Asia and Australia. Look under the Chinese, you will find entries listed not only for mainland China, but for Malaysia and for the Chinese in North America. But look on the Africa and the Africans, the only entries on the Africans relate to the continent itself. There are no entries on the Africans overseas. There is no such category. Africans who have been raped from the continent mysteriously disappear and become Negroes.
While working as a professor at UE in Jamaica, Rodney hosted sessions specifically educating Rastafarians, the poor, and Black working class youth, which worried the Jamaican government. Rodney became an enemy of the Jamaican government because he criticized them for their neo-colonial dependency, capitalism, and inequality, and his teachings threatened to radicalize Jamaicans to reject that inequality and corruption. Eventually, the Jamaican Prime Minister Hugh Shearer banned Walter Rodney from re-entering the country in 1968, which led to what was called the Rodney Riots, which were days of mass protests and unrest in Kingston, Jamaica. Walter Rodney's impact was global, and it only intensified with the publishing of his book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. In that book, he argued that Africa was not poor, it was deliberately underdeveloped by the imperialist empires who colonized it, interfered with, and destabilized its governments. And he linked slavery, colonialism, and capitalism together structurally. To this day, that book is a seminal text if you're trying to understand what's happened in Africa. Walter Rodney became a prolific scholar and professor all over the world, but eventually, in 1974, he did return to Guyana, hoping to use what he'd learned and taught the world to challenge the authoritarian leadership of Forbes Burnham. He formed the Working People's Alliance, which was a multiracial working class coalition. Remember how Thomas Sankara explained that imperialism is a threat that lives in and outside of the country? Well, Forbes Burnham was proof of that. Burnham had risen to power in 1964 through the US and British interference to prevent a leftist government under Chetty Jagan. Forbes Burnham was already an ally and agent of empire. He rigged elections, used police to suppress opposition, relied heavily on racial polarization between the Afro-Guyanese and Indo-Guyanese people. He centralized all the power within himself. He maintained financial dependency on the West and was careful not to rustle any imperialist feathers. Burnham saw Rodney as a threat to his leadership because he was.
This is a period that has been marked by two developments. It has been marked
brothers and sisters. It is important to realize that these two things go together. Brother Thomas, a long time ago, wrote a fundamental document of our party. It was a document out of which we derived the slogan, bread and justice. And bread and justice has remained the slogan of the Working People's Alliance. And we will adhere to that slogan and fight for that slogan for as long as it is necessary.
Walter Rodney was a Marxist who opposed capitalism, colonialism, European and Western dependency, and globally supported and influenced Pan-African movement. Forbes Burnham responded to the Working People's Alliance, much like Eric Gary had responded to the challenges posed by the New Jewel movement in Grenada, with violence and intimidation. But unlike the New Jewel movement and Maurice Bishop, who had still managed to seize power if only for a little while, Walter Rodney was assassinated before he ever got the chance. On June 13, 1980, he was killed when a bomb he'd unknowingly been handed by a member of the Guyana Defense Force exploded in his car. Maurice Bishop and Walter Rodney were killed, but that's not the only way revolutions were crushed in the Caribbean that we have to discuss before finally traveling to America. Haiti's Jean-Bertrand Artiste and Jamaica's Michael Manley come to mind, because neither were killed, but both are illustrative of the other ways European empires maintained control. For Haiti, the method was coup destabilization. Haiti's Jean-Bertrand Artiste became Haiti's first president elected in a truly democratic election in 1990, and he won in a landslide. He believed in mass populism to benefit the poor majority. He condemned elite corruption and military repression. He wasn't killed, but he faced multiple US-backed coups and invasions that got him removed as president twice. For Jamaica, the method was economic warfare. Jamaica's Michael Manley believed in democratic socialism. In service of that goal, he expanded workers' protections, education, the minimum wage, and social welfare, as well as he pursued economic independence for Jamaica and built a close relationship with Fidel Castro. Manley wasn't assassinated, but the IMF economically punished Jamaica, and European interference cost him the next election. Earlier, I explained that Haiti was a threat because successful Black revolutions challenged the European belief that Black people were not capable of defeating white people or governing themselves. So what became essential after these revolutions, when Black countries gained their independence and formed their own governments, was to quietly destabilize and sabotage those governments so that their own people would come to internalize the belief that they were not capable of governing themselves, that they had been better off under colonial rule. Now, it's finally time to travel to America to talk about one of the most influential revolutionary figures in the world, whose story, much like Haiti's, was rewritten to quell a movement. Let's talk about Martin Luther King Jr.
I am happy to join with you today in what will go down in history as the greatest demonstration for freedom in the history of our nation.
The United States has boasted of their democracy on the world stage since the country's inception, despite the fact that said democracy's economy was built through the labor of at least 4 million enslaved Africans who were forced to work on cotton and tobacco plantations from 1619 to 1865. Enslaved Africans in America were beaten, tortured, raped for hundreds of years before slavery was abolished as a result of a civil war that ended in southern states being compensated for the loss of the enslaved people that the United States considered their subhuman property, undeserving of equal rights, voting rights, or even proportional representation in Congress. As was the case for the former colonies in the Caribbean and Africa, the abolition of slavery in America in no way freed the enslaved Africans and their descendants or materially changed the conditions of servitude that had been placed upon them. By the 1950s, Black people in America lived under a rigid racial caste system. In the South, Jim Crow laws legally mandated segregation in schools, transportation, housing, and public life. In the North, segregation operated through redlining, employment discrimination, and policing practices. Black citizens were systematically blocked from voting through literacy tests and poll taxes. Economic mobility was constrained by sharecropping, labor exclusion, and wage exploitation. Racial violence was both symbolic and structural. Lynchings, bombings, police brutality, and economic retaliation maintained order. As this was happening, the United States was busy presenting itself internationally as the defender of democracy during the Cold War. The contradiction between American freedom abroad and racial apartheid at home, and the rise of organizations like SNCC, the SCLC, and the Black Panthers Party, as well as leaders like Malcolm X, Huey Newton, Stokely Carmichael, W.E.B. Du Bois, A. Philip Randolph, Marcus Garvey, and so many more. But one of the most prominent figures to arise out of the civil rights movement was Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.
I have the audacity to believe that peoples everywhere can have 3 meals a day for their bodies, education and culture for their minds, and dignity, equality, and freedom for their spirits. I believe that what self-centered men have torn down, men other-centered can build up. I still believe that we shall overcome. This faith can give us courage to face the uncertainties of the future. It will give our tired feet new strength as we continue our forward stride toward the city of freedom. When our days become dreary with low hovering clouds, and our nights become darker than 1,000 midnights, we will know that we are living in the creative turmoil of a genuine civilization, struggling to be born.
Martin Luther King Jr. was a pastor from Atlanta who had been educated in Morehouse University. He wasn't initially an organizer or an activist, but his charisma, his intelligence, and his oratory abilities made him the perfect person to help lead the Montgomery bus boycotts in Montgomery, Alabama, which gained national and international attention when Rosa Parks was arrested for refusing to give up her seat at the front of the bus. The Montgomery bus boycotts lasted 381 days. Black people in Montgomery successfully organized to make it possible that they could be without the buses for more than a year. Despite the peaceful nature of these protests and all demonstrations that Martin Luther King Jr. led as a staunch advocate of nonviolence, the United States responded, as empire always does, with violence, which exposed their hypocrisy on the world stage. The same country pretending to be a champion of democracy abroad as an excuse to invade and colonize Black nations could be seen in photos and news footage hosing their citizens, sicking dogs on them, and using police to brutalize them for daring to demand equality and human dignity. However, the exposure of that hypocrisy did nothing to deter America from doing to Martin Luther King Jr. what they've done to and continue to do to any Black person who challenges them. They criminalized him. Martin Luther King Jr. was arrested approximately 29 times between 1955 and 1968 for fighting for segregation and voter discrimination. While sitting in a Birmingham jail, he penned a now famous letter responding to his critics that's referred to as his letter from Birmingham jail. In that letter, dated April 16, 1963, Dr. King said in part, "We know through painful experience that freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed. Frankly, I have yet to engage in a direct action campaign that was well-timed in the view of those who have not suffered unduly from the disease of segregation. For years now, I have heard the word wait. It rings in the ear of every Negro with piercing familiarity. This wait has almost always meant never. We must come to see, with one of our distinguished jurists, that justice too long delayed is justice denied. We have waited for more than 340 years for our constitutional and God-given rights. Of Asia and Africa are moving with jet-like speed toward gaining political independence, but we still creep at horse and buggy pace towards gaining a cup of coffee at a lunch counter. Perhaps it is easy for those who have never felt the stinging darts of segregation to say wait. But when you have seen vicious mobs lynch your mothers and fathers at will and drown your sisters and brothers at whim, when you have seen hate-filled policemen curse, kick, and even kill your Black brothers and sisters, when you see the vast majority of your 20 million Negro brothers smothering in an airtight cage of poverty in the midst of an affluent society, when you suddenly find your tongue twisted and your speech stammering as you seek to explain to your 6-year-old daughter why she can't go to the public amusement park that has just been advertised on television, and see tears welling up in her eyes when she is told that Funtown is closed to colored children, and see ominous clouds of inferiority beginning to form in her little mental sky, and see her beginning to distort her personality by developing an unconsciousness bitterness towards white people. When you have to concoct an answer for a 5-year-old son who is asking, "Daddy, why do white people treat colored people so mean?" When you take a cross-country drive and find it necessary to sleep night after night in the uncomfortable corners of your automobile because no motel will accept you. when you are humiliated day in and day out by nagging signs reading white and colored, when your first name becomes nigger or your middle name becomes boy, however old you are, and your last name becomes John, and your wife and mother are never given the respected title Mrs., when you are harried by day and haunted by night by the fact that you are a Negro, living constantly at tiptoe stands, never quite knowing what to expect next, and are plagued with inner fears and outer resentments, when you are forever fighting a degenerating sense of nobodiness, then you will understand why we find it difficult to wait. There comes a time when the cup of endurance runs over and men are no longer willing to be plunged into the abyss of despair. I hope, sirs, you can understand our legitimate and unavoidable impatience. Oppressed people cannot remain oppressed forever. The yearning for freedom eventually manifests itself, and that is what has happened to the American Negro. Something within him has reminded him of his birthright of freedom, and something without has reminded him that it can be gained. Consciously or unconsciously, he has been caught up by the zeitgeist, and with his black brothers of Africa and his brown and yellow brothers of Asia, South America, and the Caribbean, the United States Negro is moving with a sense of great urgency towards the promised land of racial justice. If one recognizes this vital urge that has engulfed the Negro community, one should readily understand why public demonstrations are taking place. The Negro has many pent-up resentments and latent frustrations, and he must release them. So let him march. Let him make prayer pilgrimages to the city hall. Let him go on freedom rides and try to understand why he must do so. If his repressed emotions are not released in nonviolent ways, they will seek expression through violence. This is not a threat, but a fact of history. So I have not said to my people, get rid of your discontent. Rather, I have tried to say that this normal and healthy discontent can be channeled into the creative outlet of nonviolent direct action. And now, this approach is being termed extremist? But though I was initially disappointed at being categorized as an extremist, as I continued to think about the matter, I gradually gained a measure of satisfaction from the label. Was not Jesus an extremist for love? Love your enemies, bless them that curse you, do good to them that hate you, and pray for them which despitefully use you and persecute you. Was not Amos an extremist for justice? Let justice roll down like water and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. Was not Paul an extremist for the Christian gospel? I bear in my body the marks of the Lord Jesus. Was not Martin Luther an extremist? Here I stand, I cannot do otherwise, so help me God. And John Bunyan, I will stay in jail to the end of my days before I make a butchery of my conscience. And Abraham Lincoln, this nation cannot survive half slave and half free. And Thomas Jefferson, we hold those truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. So the question is not whether we will be extremists, but what kind of extremists we will be. Will we be extremists for hate or for love? Perhaps the South, the nation and the world are in dire need of creative extremists. I had hoped that the white moderate would see this need. Perhaps I was too optimistic. Perhaps I expected too much. I suppose I should have realized that few members of the oppressor race can understand the deep groans and passionate yearnings of the oppressed race, and still fewer have the vision to see that injustice must be rooted out by strong, persistent, and determined action. I wish that you had commended the Negro sit-inners and demonstrators of Birmingham for their sublime courage, their willingness to suffer, and their amazing discipline in the midst of great provocation. One day, the South will recognize its real heroes. They will be the James Merediths with the noble sense of purpose that enables them to face jeering and hostile mobs, and with the agonizing loneliness that characterizes the life of the pioneer. They will be old, oppressed, battered Negro women, symbolized in a 72-year-old woman in Montgomery, Alabama, who rose up with a sense of dignity and with her people decided not to ride segregated buses, and who responded with ungrammatical profundity to one who inquired about her weariness. My feet is tired, but my soul is at rest.
I still have a dream. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal.
Martin Luther King Jr. brought hundreds of thousands of people to Washington to hear his dream, that one day he'd live in a country that judged its people by the content of their character, not the color of their skin. His leadership was critical to building national pressure for sweeping federal intervention that resulted in the Civil Rights Act of 1964. which outlawed segregation in public accommodations and employment discrimination, and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which prohibited discriminatory voting practices. Martin Luther King Jr. is remembered as the man who preached nonviolence in the pursuit of racial equality and the end of segregation. He's remembered as a martyr who was assassinated because he fought to end segregation. But that memory is incomplete. Martin Luther King Jr. wasn't just killed because he opposed segregation. He was killed specifically after he began connecting racism, capitalism, and militarism into a single structural critique. In the 1950s and early 60s, King fought for desegregation and voting rights. During that phase, he was tolerated, even if begrudgingly, because his demands could be absorbed into the American system. Civil rights legislation meant reform within the system, not a radical dismantling of the entire empire it belonged to. But by 1967, King had shifted. In his Beyond Vietnam speech, he called the United States the greatest purveyor of violence in the world. He condemned imperial war abroad and poverty at home, demanding economic redistribution, a guaranteed income, and a multiracial working class coalition. That was the turning point. Once King moved from integration to economic transformation, from civil rights to anti-capitalism, from domestic protest to anti-imperialist critique, he was no longer a reformer, he was a threat. The FBI under J. Edgar Hoover surveilled him, attempted to blackmail him, and actively worked to destroy his credibility. By 1968, he was one of the most unpopular public figures in America, contrary to what they tell you now. COINTELPRO, short for Counterintelligence Program, was a secret program run by the Federal Bureau of Investigation from 1956 to 1971. Its stated purpose was to monitor subversive organizations. Its actual purpose was to disrupt, discredit, divide, and neutralize political movements the government considered threatening from within, i.e., Black people seeking equality. The FBI labeled Black nationalist groups the greatest domestic threat to U.S. security, and specifically sought to prevent the rise of a so-called Black Messiah. They targeted Black liberation movements, including the Black Panther Party, civil rights leaders, socialist and communist groups, anti-war activists, and indigenous and Puerto Rican independence movements. COINTELPRO didn't just surveil these movements, they infiltrated them. They placed informants in these organizations, fabricated criminal charges, coordinated with local police to conduct raids. They spread false rumors and forged letters to undermine both public and internal trust. They created internal rifts and caused paranoia and distrust that ripped the movements apart at the seams, which is precisely what America did to the New Deal movement in Grenada. Rumors spread that people in the party were planning to kill Maurice Bishop. Rifts formed, paranoia took hold, and it quickly escalated to the party splitting into two factions, each of which seized a fort prepared for violence that culminated in the execution of Maurice Bishop and several of his other party members. In speaking of his regret for his role in the tragedy that destroyed their revolution, Joseph Lane, one of the Grenada 17 that was imprisoned after the U.S. invaded for his role in these murders, said, "While the revolution was prepared to involve the people and give them power over important aspects of their lives, we had the tendency to approach disagreements in an immature and confrontational manner, which was fed by the paranoia over the designs of the government of the United States. The United States employed the same tactics at home that they did abroad. Whenever a Black leader can mobilize the people and poses a threat to imperialist rule appears, they're surveilled, criminalized, killed, and undermined in death to quell the movement for Black self-determination." Like Patrice Lumumba, Thomas Sankara, and Maurice Bishop, Martin Luther King Jr. crossed the invisible line. He challenged not just discriminatory policy, but power itself. And when he did, the punishment escalated. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in Memphis while supporting striking sanitation workers and organizing Black laborers. But it wasn't enough to kill him. They needed to kill what he could inspire, and that required rewriting who he was, what he believed, and what he'd done to take the revolution out of it, just as had been done to Haiti. After his death, the full scope of Martin Luther King Jr.'s teachings and work were suppressed. The later pages in the book of Martin Luther King Jr.'s life were ripped out, so to speak, leaving only his 1963 nonviolent advocacy for integration, with no trace of who he was by 1967 when he condemned imperialism. A radical critic of empire became a non-threatening symbol. The anti-capitalist minister became a poster of national unity and colorblind patriotism. That's the pattern. When Black leaders demand dignity within the system, they can be negotiated with. When they demand restructuring of the system, they are neutralized. King's story is not just about martyrdom. It's about how states absorb reformers and eliminate radicals. And like the others, he was stopped before the economic phase of his movement could fully mature. Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination is part of a long-standing and ongoing pattern in America. When a Black movement begins to take hold and a leader rises up, the US government steps in and crushes them, which is precisely what happened to the young man who joined the Black Panther Party in 1968 and became its deputy chairman a year later at just 21 years old. It's time to go to Chicago to meet a young revolutionary who was assassinated in 1969. Fred Hampton.
Everybody in the state of Illinois is going to have to be involved or even around the revolution, because we're going to have one. We're going to have to do more than talk. We're going to have to do more than listen. We're going to even have to do more than learn. We're going to have to start practicing, and that's very hard.
Fred Hampton grew up in Chicago, and he was always politically involved. Before becoming the Black Panther Party's chairman at just 21, he'd already led his local NAACP youth chapter in high school to advocate for a public swimming pool in his community. Fred Hampton was a socialist, anti-capitalist who believed that racism was indivisible from capitalism and that liberation was a class struggle, not a race struggle.
Bobby Seale is going through all types of physical and mental torture. But that's all right, because we said even before this happened, and we're going to say it after this, and after I'm locked up, and after everybody's locked up, that you can jail revolutionaries, but you can't jail a revolution.
Charismatic as he was, what made Hampton powerful wasn't just charisma. It was him as an organizer. He organized free breakfast programs, health clinics, and political education classes, turning the Panthers from what was a militant symbol into a functioning community institution. But his most dangerous act was not feeding children. It was coalition building.
We have breakfast for children because we teach the people through practice, through observation and participation, that people can be fed free. That's people thing. Socialism is the people. You're afraid of yourself. If you're afraid of socialism, you're afraid of yourself.
Like Walter Rodney, Fred Hampton wanted to and did form a multiracial working class coalition. In 1969, he created what became known as the Rainbow Coalition, uniting the Panthers with the Young Lords and the Young Patriots organization, Black, Puerto Rican, and poor white communities organizing together against police violence, poverty, and capitalism.
I'm the deputy chairman of the state of Illinois Black Panther Party, Fred Hampton. And a lot of people don't understand the Black Panther Party's relationship with white mother country radicals. A lot of people don't even understand that word that Elvis uses a lot. But what we're saying is that there are white people in the mother country that are for the same types of things that we are for stimulating revolution in the mother country. And we've said that we'll work with anybody and form coalition with anybody that has revolution on their mind. We're not a racist organization because we understand that racism is an excuse used for capitalism. And we know that racism is just it's a byproduct of capitalism.
That kind of cross-racial working class solidarity is dangerous to empire, which is why the United States government decided he was a threat. And just like Lumumba and Sankara had anticipated how imperialism would respond, understood the threat they faced, but did their work anyway, so too did Fred Hampton. He knew he was likely being surveilled by the US government.
We know they have our pictures, we know they're looking for us, we know they want us, but we're still saying that even though we could be in a sense, as far as this system goes, on the mountaintop, we in the Black Panther Party, because of our dedication and understanding what's in the valley, knowing that the people in the valley, knowing that we originally came from the valley, knowing that our flag is the same flag as the people in the valley, knowing that our enemy is on the mountaintop, our friends are in the valley, we say even though it's nice to be on the mountaintop, we're going back to the valley.
Hampton's suspicions were correct. Under the Federal Bureau of Investigation's COINTELPRO program, Hampton was surveilled and targeted, just like Martin Luther King Jr. had been. An FBI informant infiltrated his chapter, provided the police with the layout of his apartment, and on December 4th, 1969, Chicago police raided his home while he slept. Officers fired nearly 100 shots and assassinated a 21-year-old Fred Hampton as he slept in his bed, and nobody was convicted. Now that we've arrived at the end of this video, I hope when I repeat the words I opened this video with, you really hear me this time. There isn't a Black people anywhere on earth who have not felt the weight of colonization, empire, and white supremacy. And there isn't a Black people anywhere on earth who didn't resist it. From Haiti to the Congo, from Burkina Faso to Grenada, from Mississippi to Guyana, we are not a people waiting on revolution. We are a people whose revolutions were crushed, whose revolutionaries were killed, whose governments were destabilized, whose victories were rewritten, and then we were taught to forget.
We are oppressed. We are exploited. We are downtrodden. We are denied not only civil rights, but even human rights. So the only way we're going to get some of this oppression and exploitation away from us or aside from us is come together against a common enemy.
Happy Black History Month. If you enjoyed the video you just watched, it's your lucky day because you just found it on one of 7 channels inside my Olurinati-verse. Subscribe to Olurinati, my flagship channel, where you'll find my magnum opuses like If Pretty is a Privilege, Ugly is a Curse, How This Didn't Age Well, Destroyed Media Literacy, How Men Become Aziz Ansari, and more. Subscribe to Olurinati Pop for my TV and film essays on shows like How I Met Your Mother, Sex and the City, Desperate Housewives, You, Euphoria, Insecure, and so many more. You can also join Olurinati Pop on Patreon to watch all of my YouTube videos uncensored. Subscribe to Olurinati Bites for short, serious, and nuanced commentary on whatever the internet is spiraling about. Subscribe to Olay and Chill if you're trying to laugh and chill while unpacking the latest TikTok chaos. Subscribe to Olurinati Politics for sharp breakdowns of the political moments shaping our lives right now. Subscribe to Olurinati Extras for music commentary and industry deep dives. Subscribe to Olay and Friends to watch your favorite Black thinkers and creators dissect the culture. Subscribe to any or all the channels in the Olurinati-verse that speak to you, and I'll see you there. And you can also follow me on Instagram, TikTok, Threads, and Blue Sky at Olurinati. And you can also follow Olurinati Pop and Olay and Chill on Instagram and TikTok so you never miss a thing.